My name is Whitley, and I'm 32 years old. I stood in the small dressing room of St. Agnes Chapel, staring at myself in a mirror that had seen 100 brides before me, and I felt nothing but a hollow, aching dread where joy should have been. My wedding dress fit perfectly. My hair was pinned exactly the way I'd practiced, and my bouquet of white roses trembled slightly in my hands because I could hear my father's voice through the thin wall, loud enough that half the guests probably heard it too. "He works in a warehouse," my father was saying to my uncle, not even bothering to lower his voice. "A warehouse? My daughter, marrying a nobody who drives a forklift for a living." I closed my eyes and breathed through it, the way I'd been breathing through it for the past 8 months, ever since I brought Julian home for the first time. My family had never given him a fair chance. My mother had asked him, in front of everyone at Thanksgiving, whether he had any actual plans for his future, as if raising 2 younger siblings alone after his parents died in a car accident when he was 19 wasn't a plan, wasn't a life, wasn't proof of exactly the kind of man he was. My father had refused to shake his hand the first time they met and had never warmed since. To them, Julian's calloused hands and modest apartment and steady, unglamorous job made him invisible, made him nothing, made him someone not worth their respect. But I loved him. I loved the way he remembered how I took my coffee, the way he'd driven 4 hours through a snowstorm just to bring me soup when I was sick, the way he never once asked me to choose between him and my family, even when they made it clear they'd rather he didn't exist. So when my father knocked on the dressing room door and stepped inside without waiting for an answer, I already knew what was coming. "Your grandfather isn't here," he said flatly. "He had a golf thing. And frankly, Whitley, I'm not walking you down that aisle either. I'm not going to stand up in front of 200 people and pretend I'm proud of this." I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me it was a joke, but his face stayed cold and certain. "Dad, please," I whispered. "It's my wedding day. Walk yourself. That's what happens when you marry a nobody." He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather, and then he turned and walked back out toward the chapel. A moment later, through the cracked door, I watched him settle into a pew in the very back row beside my mother, arms crossed, chin lifted, positioning himself like a spectator at some show he intended to enjoy. Dad laughed and sat down in the back row with Mom to watch me do it, as if my humiliation was the entertainment he'd been waiting for all week. The wedding coordinator appeared at my elbow, her face uncertain, asking if I wanted to postpone, if I wanted someone else to step in. I looked past her toward the closed chapel doors, toward the muffled sound of 200 guests waiting, toward Julian somewhere on the other side already standing at the altar, probably wondering what was taking so long. And something inside me hardened. I would not let my father's cruelty steal this day from me. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. "No," I said, straightening my spine. "I'll walk myself." The doors opened, and the music swelled, and every head turned toward me. I gripped my bouquet and started down the aisle alone, my heels echoing against the old wooden floor, my eyes fixed straight ahead on Julian, who stood frozen at the altar, his jaw tight, clearly having just realized what my father had done. I could feel the whispers rippling through the pews behind me, could feel eyes crawling over my empty side, searching for the father who should have been there, and finding only empty space where he should have stood. I was halfway down the aisle, my breath shaking, my knees nearly giving out from the weight of 200 stairs, when I heard the heavy chapel doors behind me creak open again. Halfway, the doors behind me swung open, and I froze, thinking perhaps my father had changed his mind, that some flicker of shame had finally reached him. But when I turned, what I saw made my heart stop entirely. 30 strangers in matching gray walked in and lined both sides of the aisle, moving with a quiet, deliberate precision that silenced the entire chapel. They wore identical charcoal gray suits, their faces solemn and unified, and they positioned themselves shoulder to shoulder along both rows of pews like a wall of silent witnesses. Gasps rippled through the guests. My mother half rose from her seat. My father's smug expression cracked into confusion. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone used to being obeyed, stopped directly beside the back row. He turned, looked straight at my dad, and said, "Sir," and the entire chapel went utterly, deathly silent, waiting to hear what would come next, waiting to understand exactly who these 30 strangers were and why they had come. Sir, the silver-haired man repeated, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made the entire chapel lean in to listen. With respect, you don't get to sit there and enjoy this. Not after what you just did to your daughter. My father's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out, while my mother's hand flew to her chest. I stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, my bouquet trembling, utterly unable to understand what was happening or who these 30 people even were. The silver-haired man turned toward me and offered a small, respectful nod. Mrs. Whitley, forgive us for the dramatic entrance. My name is Desmond Okafor. I'm the Regional Director of Operations for Hallcrest Logistics. The name meant nothing to me at first, until I saw Julian's face at the altar, pale with shock, his eyes glistening as recognition dawned. Hallcrest Logistics was the company Julian worked for. Desmond Okafor was Julian's boss's boss, a man Julian had mentioned only a handful of times, always with quiet respect. 6 years ago, Desmond continued, his voice steady enough to reach every corner of the silent chapel. Julian Reyes walked into our warehouse as a 19-year-old kid who just lost both his parents and was raising 2 younger siblings on his own. He took every shift he could get. He never complained. He trained new hires without being asked, caught safety violations that saved us from lawsuits, and quietly mentored a dozen young men who had nowhere else to turn. 2 years ago, when our Denver facility was about to shut down and put 400 people out of work, Julian was the one who redesigned our entire intake process and saved that location. He is, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary employees I have had in 30 years of business. I felt tears sliding down my cheeks. Not from sadness now, but from something fuller, something like pride cracking open in my chest. Desmond gestured to the 30 people standing along the aisle. Every single person standing here today works under Julian in some capacity, or worked alongside him and asked to be here the moment they heard what his own family thought of him. We didn't come to make a scene. We came because a man who has quietly held up so many people deserved to have someone hold him up today, especially when the people who were supposed to didn't show up. He looked directly at my father again. A forklift operator, sir, is what you called him. I'd call him the backbone of a company with 4,000 employees, and frankly, I'd trust him with far more than I trust most men in suits. The chapel erupted into a hush of whispers and a few scattered claps that grew louder, and I watched my father's face drain of all its arrogance, replaced by something small and ashamed, something he clearly hadn't expected to feel in front of 200 witnesses. My mother stared at her hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I turned back toward the aisle, toward Julian, who was openly crying now, his shoulders shaking as he watched the people he'd quietly helped for years stand up for him in the one moment he needed it most. Desmond stepped back respectfully and gestured toward me. Please continue. We just wanted him to know he wasn't walking into this family alone. I gripped my bouquet and walked the rest of the aisle between 2 rows of strangers who felt, in that moment, more like family than the people I'd grown up with. When I reached Julian, he took my hands and whispered that he loved me, his voice breaking, and I whispered back that I had never been prouder to become his wife. The ceremony continued, but it was different now, charged with something electric, something the whole room had witnessed and would never forget. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage, the silence was so complete you could hear the candles flickering, and I glanced at my father, who kept his eyes down and said nothing at all. We exchanged our vows, and when Julian slid the ring onto my finger, the entire chapel rose to its feet in applause, the 30 strangers in gray clapping loudest of all. At the reception, my father approached me once, stiffly, and mumbled something that was almost an apology, something about not realizing, about being wrong. I told him I appreciated the words, but that actions mattered more, and that he had a long way to go before I would trust that he meant them. Julian, ever gracious, still shook his hand, still thanked him for coming, because that was who Julian was, a man who built bridges even for people who never deserved the effort. Later that night, dancing under string lights with Julian's arms around me, I realized my father had spent years trying to convince me that Julian was worth nothing, when in truth Julian was worth more than my father would ever understand. Value was never about job titles or salaries. It was about showing up, about quietly building people up instead of tearing them down, about being the kind of person 30 strangers would drop everything to defend. My family mocked my husband as a nobody and let me walk alone, but in the end, It was Julian's nobody who filled that aisle with somebodies, and it was Julian's love that made me understand what true worth actually looks like.